Dr. Joey Senat is an associate professor in the OSU School of Media and Strategic Communications, where he teaches mass communications law, responsibility in mass communication, public affairs reporting, and censorship. His PhD in mass communications law is from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He also holds an MA in journalism from Memphis State University and a BA in journalism from Louisiana State University. Dr. Senat's awards include Outstanding Professor in School of Journalism and Broadcasting, Outstanding Professor in College of Arts and Sciences, Marian Opala First Amendment Award, the Society of Professional Journalists Distinguished Service to the First Amendment Award, and Top 10 Best New Blogs for Oklahoma. He coordinates OSU's High School Journalism Day for the Oklahoma Collegiate Media Association, and he is the author of Mass Communication Law in Oklahoma, which is used in newsrooms across the state. He is quoted frequently by the media on freedom of information and First Amendment issues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joey Senat as he presents his talk, Popular Intolerance and Political Cowardice, Stepping Stones to a Fahrenheit 451 Future.
Good evening, how are you? Just like my students, you've all sat way in the back. I promise I'm not a spitter that I know of, I don't drool. So they asked me to come and speak to this, and I originally did this years ago in Claremore. It was the first time I did this version of this speech about Fahrenheit 451, and the idea comes from some of the comments that are made. As it was noted, I teach censorship as well, and clearly the book deals a lot with censorship. So can we have a first click there? If you can't see this, and I don't know if... yeah, it'll help. But if you can't see this, it's a picture of George Bush with a Hitler mustache, and it says "Worst President Ever," and down at the bottom, and I know you can't see it from here, but it says "The Antichrist is here." And hit the next one. More comparisons of the U.S. president to Hitler. Hit the next one. And another comparison of, whoa, wrong president. Not so many chuckles this time. Let's see the next one. No chuckles on that one at all. Next one. Next one. My point in bringing these up is often, and I've done these slides with different audiences, and interesting how many people think the Bush ones are funny, and as soon as the Barack Obama ones come up, they stop. Wow, it's not funny anymore. It's all about your point of view on what should be censored and who should be censored, correct? And I see that all the time from the left and the right and the middle. What we're going to censor, who we're going to censor depends on what I like and what I don't like. Fortunately, the First Amendment doesn't work that way. Let's go ahead and have the next one. So when I talk about popular intolerance, that idea comes from John Stuart Mill, but he's talking about where community censorship, where the majority would silence the minority. By the way, that could be done through government, the church, some authority. It could be done through economic pressures. It could be done through your neighbors silencing you. We had a lot of community censorship in this country in the colonial days. We tend to think of this country as having been, rah-rah for the revolution, but there were towns where, were still Tories, and in towns that were rah-rah for the revolution, you couldn't speak up and say, "Go King George," without your neighbors, not the law, your neighbors finding some way to censor you, to quiet you. Okay? All right, so the next one. Now, in this book, my point is that Bradbury's really writing about a much different era in communication, mass communication, right? Okay, and in this situation, it's about the media trying to avoid trying to avoid offending the audience to make money. Go ahead and click the next one. So essentially, he's talking about a society in which it's popular to be intolerant. And I pull out several phrases from the book to make this point. And I want you to think about, does that begin to describe, knowing that he wrote this more than 50 years ago, do you think that describes our current society and media culture? So he says up there, you know, film and radio, magazines and books, and radio was starting to come to an end there. TV was starting to replace it. Leveled down to a sort of paste pudding norm. Next one, please. So don't step on the toes of the dog lovers, the cat lovers, doctors, lawyers, merchants, chiefs, Mormons, Baptists, Unitarians, second-generation Chinese, Swedes, Italians, Germans, Texans. God forbid, don't make fun of Texans. Brooklynites, Irishmen, people from Oregon or Mexico. He's talking about minorities. Everybody's a minority. Everybody sees themselves as some sort of minority in a segment of the population that's less than the whole. All right, so let's go to the next one. We've seen this idea. The people in this play, this TV serial, are not meant to represent any actual painters, cartographers, mechanics, anywhere. So we'd avoid offending people. The next one. The bigger your market, the less you handle controversy. Does that describe our media culture today in a lot of ways? Mass media controlled by a corporation. Colored people don't like Little Black Sambo, burn it. White people don't feel good about Uncle Tom's Cabin, burn it. Burn the book. Serenity, peace. Come back to what I think it actually is all about. Next one, please. It didn't come from the government down. There was no dictum, no declaration, no censorship to start with, no technology, mass exploitation, and minority pressure carried the trick, thank God. Does that describe today's media culture? It's not necessary to have the government start with the censorship. It's building from the bottom up because we're all so easily offended. Americans seem to believe that they have a right not to be offended. That's not what the First Amendment stands for. Or, by the way, how many of you can tell me what your state constitutional right to free speech and press is called? Where can it be found? Do we even have one? Anybody know? You do have one. In your state constitution has a right to free speech and free press that is written the opposite of the First Amendment, which is a negative. It says what government can't do. Your free speech clause in this state says you are entitled to write what you want, but you can be held responsible for abuses of that right. Our state Supreme Court has said that our state constitutional free speech provision, free press provision, is stronger, gives you more rights than the First Amendment. But I do a lot of speeches every year, talks with people, and I ask, and it's like nobody knows that even exists. You've got a whole set of freedom there that you're not taking advantage of. All right, let's move on to the next one. Now, when Bradbury's writing this, he's really talking about self-censorship, but this had already been in play. The penny press, way back in the mid-1800s, the idea was we made it cheaper to buy a newspaper, 1 penny. Well, why? So we can get more audience. And the media switched from selling the news to an audience to selling an audience to whom? Advertisers, that's right. So now we want that big audience. So we don't offend anybody in that audience. So you start seeing that pudding paste norm, right? All right, so next one. So corporate censorship. Not talking about government. What Bradbury's talking about starts with the people. So if you can't read this, anybody recognize who that is? Duck Dynasty guy, Phil Robertson. It says, "It seems like to me a vagina as a man would be more desirable than a man's anus." That's just me. I'm just thinking there's more there. But hey, sin, it's not logical, my man. Start with homosexual behavior and just morph out from there. Bestiality, and actually his full quote goes on talking about some other stuff, but that's usually where they cut it off at. So what's the next thing that happens? He's suspended. How many, right? He's not going to be on A&E's Duck Dynasty. How many people watch Duck Dynasty? In this room watch it. Nobody? Occasionally? Okay, that's good. I thought we were going to get, okay. Hang on to that thought for a second. I may need you in a minute. All right, so the next slide. I'm with Phil. I stand with Phil. Did you stand with Phil? Yeah. Yep. All right, in what way? She's moving, by the way. Your wife just moved a seat over. Why? What did you stand for with him, in what way?
That he has the right to have that point of view, whether you agree with it or not.
Okay, so he has that right to have his point of view. And my sister, I'm from Louisiana. I'm from Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Okay, and I know my sister watches that show, and she put up on her Facebook page, I'm stand with Phil. And my aunt, who used to live in New Orleans before Katrina, now most of my family lives over in Mississippi somewhere, which is actually worse than Louisiana. So they're putting up, I stand with Phil. But do they stand with Phil for what he's saying? His right to say, where's that right come from? The First Amendment. First Amendment gives him the right to say that and not be censored by A&E, which is the network that puts out his show. Hold on, don't spoil my surprise. So the next slide, he says, if I can't speak my mind, this ain't America anymore. Okay, next. So this is a Facebook thing that goes up where Phil Robertson's First Amendment rights violated when A&E suspended him. Yes, and here's what you can do to help him fight back. And they got the Bill of Rights up there. Next one. And I wish I could do this guy's voice, but I really can't. So, what if I told you, Matrix, that the Duck Dynasty issue has nothing to do with the First Amendment? Nothing. He still has his right to say and hold his beliefs. He's not going to jail. He didn't go to jail. He can go out on a sidewalk and hand out all the brochures he wants with his philosophy. And by the way, if you look him up online, he's got all kinds of sayings. He's the next Will Rogers, I'm sure. One day they will look back and his sayings will be in newspapers like the Oklahoman at the bottom. His rights were not violated by A&E. A&E has a right to control what goes out over the airwaves, cable lines for its station. They pay him. And they've actually paid him a pretty good bit of money. Now, why doesn't the First Amendment apply here? Anybody know? What's required? Okay, so the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. By the way, does that mean that states and cities can censor your speech and press? Okay, so we had somebody who actually knows the answers. One person in the entire room. That's actually better than usual. So first off, there has to be state action. There has to be government involvement in the censorship in order for the First Amendment to apply. Censorship is a much broader umbrella, and it can include any kind and various definitions of censorship, but it can include various ways of stopping someone's speech or getting their press out, their voice heard. Okay? First Amendment violations are a subset of that. And violation only occurs if the government's involved, which is why, for example, to put it in more popular terms, why is it that NASCAR, if I use this in North Carolina, everybody knows what I'm talking about, NASCAR can censor its drivers, right? NFL can censor its players and coaches. The NBA can censor its players and coaches. Why? Because there's no state action. That's step one. And why is it that the First Amendment, which starts off, Congress shall make no law, applies to states? Because of the doctrine of incorporation. Because the U.S. Supreme Court back in the 30s took sort of piecemealed out those First Amendment rights and put them into the 14th Amendment. 13th, 14th Amendment, they were passed when? After the Civil War. They were to ensure the rights of former slaves wouldn't be infringed upon by those former Confederate states, okay? So one of those, the 14th Amendment, has this due process clause, and it talks about liberty. Well, what does liberty mean? And so in a series of cases in the 30s, the U.S. Supreme Court said, well, it means free speech. It means assembly, peaceful assembly, and so on. And so because the 14th Amendment applies to states, when you incorporate the First Amendment into the 14th Amendment, you now apply it to the states. Does that make sense? That's the mechanism. But it doesn't apply to A&E. A&E is not a government agency. All right, so the next one. So what was this all really about? What do you think his suspension was all really about? Economics and advertising. Political correctness is kind of I find that's usually a term by the people on the right to explain why they want to say hate speech, and they're not going to be politically correct. But politically correct in that we don't want to offend people was what A&E was saying. Say it again. Their image. Why would they be concerned about their image? People won't watch. How many people in this room were watching it the first place? One? Occasionally? He only admitted to occasionally? I don't know. Who were they afraid of offending? Who was A&E afraid of offending? All right, so do we think that there is a large segment of the homosexual population is glued in every week to Duck Dynasty and its reruns? I don't watch it in the first place. I ain't gonna. Yes. And so they want that broadest market, right? That's exactly right. And so what's a way to get that message out to that audience? But what if not all those people were even bothered, it wasn't on their radar? There's an old adage in censorship that if you want to make something popular, you censor it. You tell that teenager he or she can't read that book, right? You try to censor that movie, they all want to see it. They all want to read it. So they suspended him for less than a month leading up to the 5th season and then put him back on. Because they made sure that this message got out that here's somebody you can identify with, folks. You agree with him. You don't like those gays. But we're in Oklahoma, right? Don't we have a state constitutional provision against same-sex marriage? Right? I don't believe a whole lot of Oklahomans were offended by what he said. Some, yes. The majority, I don't think so. So what was it all about? 1 million fans hitting like on Facebook in less than 24 hours. Cha-ching! Thunder Moneyball. Cha-ching! You've now increased your audience because they all got upset. Hey, you're stopping him from saying, I'm going to watch this show and I'm going to go buy, well, for a while they were saying, don't buy that Duck Dynasty, only buy the Duck Commander, which is the family business that does the duck calls. Well, now it's okay. Go back and buy the Duck Dynasty stuff. Anybody here ever buy Duck Dynasty pillows, dolls? Have you ever seen the merchandise in Walmart for Duck Dynasty? It's a huge amount of stuff you can buy. This was corporate censorship to make money. is my impression of the way it went down. This guy's been saying this stuff for years. He says it on the show, this kind of stuff. If you were really sensitive to these issues, you would not be watching it. Okay, well then don't watch it. Was there really going to be an economic boycott? No, it upped their ratings. All right, so the next one. So we asked which of you supported Phil. Only one person was brave enough to say, I supported him, but by the way, I only supported him because he has his right. He has a right. A&E had a right to say no. So now the next question is, those folks out there, like in Louisiana, who said, I stand with Phil. Westboro. Next one. That's all right, you're getting the message, believe me. Now, some of those same people that would say, Phil Robertson's got this right to say this, well, they must agree with, allow Westboro to say what it wants to say, right? Now we're going from that popular intolerance to the other part of the equation that I bring out, which is political cowardice. Okay, how many people are saying, yeah, I supported Phil Robertson? Well, I know a lot of people who are anti-homosexual, and that's why they supported Phil Robertson. But at the same time, the same people are saying Westboro can't speak up. Why? What is it about what Westboro does that offends them? Which group of people would that larger population support? Veterans. It's not what they're saying, it's where they're saying. People get so offended, they're not offended at what those people are saying. They're offended at where they're saying it. So next line. These are pictures from out at the funerals of soldiers, right? Go ahead, next one. So Shirley Phelps Roper was one of the speakers at our First Amendment Congress. FOI Oklahoma runs a First Amendment Congress. It used to be 2 days. Now we whittled it down just to 1 day for high school students. But when it was still 2 days and we had it at OSU, she came and spoke. And OSU, by the way, was so worried there would be trouble that they had police show up in case there was, a riot or something. So she spoke. She's very civil. She's an attorney. She makes her points. This is what she believes in. How different is what her point is from Phil Robertson's? Aren't they arguing the same thing? But it's where and how they do it. So why do you think Westboro picks those occasions to get out and speak? In fact, they're just a small group, right? We're not talking hundreds of people. We're talking 4, 5, 10 maybe of the family who shows up. Where do they show up at? The funerals of veterans, usually. They will show up at other places, funerals usually. Why show up there? Attention. The media. Notoriety. The news stations get out there and show the video, gets them ratings, and it gets them attention. It's that if you want to make something popular, censor it. If you want to get your voice heard, get censored. Well, legislators are doing them a favor across the country. So we're one of the states that passes a statute that says you cannot picket a certain distance and certain time before and after the actual services. Now, the way these laws have to be written, they cannot be based on just saying Westboro cannot be here. Because the First Amendment says censorship is supposed to be viewpoint neutral. In other words, the government cannot censor you because of your viewpoint. And when they're out on the sidewalk, they're in a public forum, a traditional public forum. So the government regulation has to be content neutral. You can regulate when they speak, where they speak, how they speak. For example, let's say the OSU campus. If somebody goes over to an area in the middle of the day and uses a bullhorn while classes are going on, we could say no, right? That's a manner of speech that interrupts the normal function of the school building, right? We can stop when, where. We can control those with reasonable regulation. When, where, how. but not what you're saying, not content. So they have to write this. So what does this mean? What is an unintended consequence of this? Do you think there's a time when people might want to show up at a funeral and protest somebody else? Remember that big boom in Oklahoma City a long time ago? Somebody gets executed for that. You think you might want to show up at his funeral and make sure everybody knows that you can't stand this guy? Why? Well, so it can't be written this way. Now, this kind of statute's been struck down in another state because the judge pointed out that it was so broad, the distance was so far, it just says you can't picket. So if you were down the street as part of a labor union and you were, picketing against a company during that time and you were close enough, that banned it. This is too broad. This is overly broad, which means it's unconstitutional. Go to the next one. So there's some reasons why, for speech reasons, why you would want to allow, or the argument for funeral protests. Picketing is an important way. I realize in this room a whole lot of people, most of you, if not all of you, but probably at least most of you, don't agree with Westboro. Their point of view, not just where they're doing it, but their point of view. But the First Amendment protects their right to do that. So when we have legislators who are trying to look good for constituents that would write a law that would stop that despicable speech, you better worry about the slippery slope. When's it going to be your turn to have your speech shut down because someone doesn't like it? All right, next one. Courts can argue that, we'll just tell them to go put up a newspaper ad or a billboard. I want to get my attention here and now. I want to get my message out here and now. Next one. When you're saying you can't do it during a particular time, you're saying you cannot, you have a total constraint, 0. You cannot show up. So what would be some other options besides a ban in a public forum? Suggestions? Other ways to deal with a public forum issue where you could regulate their manner of speech. By the way, have you ever seen where they go into a town and then the motorcycles show up, right? That's a heckler's veto, where a member of the public can shout you down, and they've got the big engines roaring. What's louder, those 5 people screaming or all those motorcycles? So let's go to the next one. So click on it. Now, you can ban noisy picketing, right? You can ban blocking traffic. They can't stand out in the middle of the street without a parade permit, which they're not trying to get. It's the next one. The volume. You cannot use a bullhorn. Next one. But you can't ban their message because it's offensive. And yes, they are offensive to the majority of us in this room. I'm sure of that. But this is where we say, you know what? You've got to stand up for the people you don't like, because your voice will be the next one that gets silenced. Let's go on to the next one. And we have a history in this state of writing laws to try to stop this. And in the late 30s and early 40s, this went on in a lot of towns, including twice in Stillwater, where the Jehovah's Witnesses, is there a Jehovah's Witness in the room who would? No? That's unfortunate, because I always want them to stand up and take a round of applause and go back and share it with their fellows, because they are responsible for a lot of our First Amendment freedoms, because they have pushed the envelope. It's their cases about that unpopular speech that guarantees the rest of us the right to speak up and speak out on issues. So in Stillwater, for example, had a ban on distributing any sort of literature. So they came into town and they handed out the Watchtower and they got arrested. And the court struck that down. So Stillwater turned around and said, all right, well, we'll write one that says they can't hand out anything that'll upset the public. Because no matter where they went, I mean, what was it that they believed in that upset people at that time? We're not going to salute the flag. We will not salute the flag because we feel like it's an idol, false idol. We hand out a publication that says that. We hand out a publication that speaks on behalf of pacifism. So they would go to these towns, Stillwater, Guyman, and big crowd, and they'd be downtown, and big crowds would gather and attack them. One of my favorite stories out of the court case is one of the Jehovah's Witnesses, I guess she'd had enough of pacifism because she put a big jar of hand cream in her purse and started swinging it to back off the crowd. Well, they would arrest the Jehovah's Witnesses for disturbing the peace as they were getting beaten up. Now, we have a U.S. Supreme Court case that says the First Amendment does not condone a heckler's veto. In other words, I'm not going to silence you because your audience is intolerant and might take action. It's government's job to stop them from attacking you. And you'll see this when, for example, the Klan might speak in a town, right? If there's anything left of the Ku Klux Klan, but it's what I grew up seeing on the streets, marching. And then there'd be the other side on the other side of the street, and there'd be police in between them. That's the job of law enforcement there. Not to arrest the one who's speaking because other people are not tolerant enough to control themselves. So we had one of these cases here. Go ahead and switch to the next one. So the Court of Criminal Appeals in our state eventually reversed his conviction. And I think what the court said here is important to remember now while our legislature is so willing to write laws that would stop others from speaking out. So while citizens have served their country and have given their life's blood for the principles for which it stands, yet our Constitution and our democracy are based upon freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. The defendant may be wrong in the opinion of the court. The court's saying, look, we don't agree with this guy. But the principles which are applied by the dictator nations of the world should not be applied here. Next one. We should rather hope that the sacrifices of blood and lives of the young men of this country will be a lesson which may bring this defendant and those with whom he is associated to their senses and to an appreciation of the flag of this country and for the noble principles for which it stands. But you can't censor the guy. You can't arrest him. Good. Here's a more recent example of despicable speech that the legislature decided to outlaw. All right, so which of you have played violent video games? There we go. You played that entire series. Pat, have you played this game? I see you, Pat. You've been playing this video game at home. All right, so Postal 2, it's one of these shooter games, right? Isn't that the way to describe it? I'm old, I don't know. All right. So players shoot schoolgirls in the knees, set them on fire, and urinate on their corpses. In one scene, a black victim is shot, and the shooter jokes about welfare reform and remarks, "These people really do all look alike." At another point, a victim pleads for her life before being bludgeoned with a shovel. Then her body is urinated upon. Horrible stuff. Right? I mean, it's like one step worse than a Schwarzenegger movie in terms of violence. All right, so the next one. So our state legislator says we're going to ban violent video games. You cannot sell them to minors. Yeah, that's one of the first things. Inappropriate. What is inappropriate? What you think is inappropriate and what I think is inappropriate might be two different things. Probably are. Probably. I don't know. That's a good question. Did the sales go up? But that's vague, unconstitutionally vague. You need a bright line in the law that tells people what they're going to do that would get them into trouble. Inappropriate is not one of those. College speech codes across the country that have always been struck down. use terms like inappropriate, rude. Those are vague descriptors. Passed unanimously in the state Senate despite the fact that these bans had already been struck down in other states as unconstitutional. Now we're getting again to the political cowardice. Because the legislators figure this: I don't want to be running for re-election and have my opponents telling Oklahomans he didn't vote against violent video games. Look what he supports. And the assumption is that you're too stupid to understand what the First Amendment would mean, that you are too intolerant to respect what the First Amendment means, that you're too stupid to dig beyond the campaign ad and figure it out. So I'm going to take the easy way out if I'm the legislator and vote against that vote for that ban, even though I know it's going to get challenged, even though I know it's going to end up in federal court, and even though I know that in every other state where it's been challenged, the federal courts have said it's unconstitutional. But not my problem. I'm only one of whatever votes. All right, so our ban gets struck down as unconstitutional. What a shock. Go ahead. First off, the threshold issue before the courts, every court is a video game protected speech? Movies had to go through the same thing. Movies, I don't know if there's anybody in the room that remembers this, but a few decades ago, we had movie censorship boards in every city. You had to show your movie to this board to get permission to show it. Are movies protected? Yes, the U.S. Supreme Court eventually said, yes, they are. Well now, and by the way, this does work its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which agrees, video games are protected speech because they have a plot, they have a theme. You may not like it, but they have characters. They can convey a message. You may not like the message, but they are protected. That doesn't mean absolute, by the way. So the government has to have a compelling reason to stop this speech. Well, the first legislatures were relying on a research by a university professor who was showing that this stuff was really bad for teens, which would be conventional wisdom, right? Wouldn't you sort of common sense say that? Except that every federal court that looked at his research ripped it apart and said, this guy isn't telling what's really going on. His research is flawed. He can't account for other factors in what's causing this behavior by the teens. Every court ripped it up. Go on. And the courts would say there is no causal link between the violence and the video games. And this is in our state, right? The court saying, beyond the defendants, the legislators, the state, generalized statements, there is a complete dearth of legislative findings, scientific studies, or other rationale on the record to support the passage of the act. Defendants' argument that common sense dictates that playing violent video games is not good for children completely fails the First Amendment. Completely fails. The First Amendment does not allow prohibitions based on, quote, common sense. You have to show us and prove to us that there's a compelling interest. The next one. Another circuit, federal circuit, says, why should we ban these things? To shield children right up to the age of 18 from exposure to violent descriptions and images, it's going to deform them, leave them unequipped to cope with the real world. That's what the appellate court said. So we're questioning whether this is even worthwhile. We're going to leave it up to mom and dad. And by the way, the laws were up to 18. You couldn't do it. All right, next one. So here's an Illinois legislator who was honest about it. That political cowardice. I supported this legislation knowing full well that it was going to get overturned because it had been overturned in other states. This legislation was really more symbolic. In other words, symbolic for my campaign the next time I run for re-election. I'm going to take that stand. Next little slap there on it. $510,000 in attorney's fees from Illinois alone. We paid out hundreds of thousands, I think $300,000 in attorney's fees. In every state, the Entertainment Software Association, the plaintiffs that were suing got their attorney's fees paid. Whose pockets does that money come out of? The taxpayer's pocket. Taxpayer money. Your money to pay for their symbolic vote that they knew would get struck down. Because it doesn't come out, tell them, it doesn't come out of their pocket. Tell them that it does from now on, and you'll see fewer of those kinds of votes. They'll start to have a backbone and stand up and say, well, this isn't right to ban this speech. I don't like this speech, but I'm going to stand up for it anyway. Next one. We talked about the First Amendment. What do you think the greatest threat to the First Amendment is? Censorship? Popular censorship? Ignorance. You're right, censorship, but why does the censorship get allowed? Ignorance of the First Amendment. What's in the First Amendment? Hold on a second. So these surveys come out, generally it's about what they say. Only 28% of Americans can name more than one freedom in the First Amendment. Only 1 in 1,000 in this one particular survey were able to name all 5. Raise your hand without saying all 5. Raise your hands if you think you know all 5. I got 1, 2 hands, 3, 4. I get the younger people in the audience raising their hands. I'm really happy. What are they? Go for it. Religion, press, how, assemble how, peacefully assemble, very good. Speech. Well, that would be back under religion, not church and state, but back under religion. That's 4. There we go, the OSU graduate from the School of Media and Strategic Communications who had the law class. The 5th one is the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. Too many words. Think petition government. How many of you can name all 5 Simpsons? Oh, more hands are going up. At least a couple. Different hands. Guys, you know all the Simpsons, right? No? It's an old person show now? Is that what you just told me? I'm the only one watching it? It's been on so long. All right, so the Simpsons, name the Simpsons. Hit the hot dog. 22% of Americans could name all 5 Simpsons. Only 1 in 1,000 could name all 5 of their First Amendment rights. Ignorance. Next one. Here's what they think is in the First Amendment. Right to trial by jury. No, that's not in the First Amendment. Right against self-incrimination. Another one. Right to vote. No, not in the First Amendment. Right to own and raise pets. The right to drive a car. While driving. I don't know if it was Polinsky or somebody else I've heard say this. He said when he was in school decades and decades ago, his civics book actually said the right to happiness was in the First Amendment. It's not. Most people also say the right to bear arms is in there. Although in this state we all know that's not the First Amendment, that's the Second Amendment. We're learning that. Next one. It's difficult to defend the First Amendment, your right to speak out, if you don't know what your rights are. Ask any high school student that. It's easy to take away the rights of high school students because they don't know that they have some rights. They do, still. Under Tinker, the U.S. Supreme Court case, you do have First Amendment rights at a public school. If we don't teach them to you, you don't know. And then you assume it's okay for government to dictate your speech. And then you get to college, and very few students in college ever take some sort of law class that would explain this to them. So then they get out. And by the way, how many Oklahomans ever earn a college degree? Anybody know? 60%? No. About 25%. So 75% of Oklahomans don't that high school civics class. That's where they learn. Their experience in high school is what teaches them about government censorship of their speech. Do I have any civics teachers in the room? Please? No? I asked this question to high school students, who teaches your civics class? And most of them say coaches. Coaches who are more interested in their teams than the student's education. Not all of them, but that's the complaint. So this is where they learn. So is it any wonder that they don't know what their First Amendment rights are, that they don't have any problem with government censoring speech, the press? That's what they were trained with. That's what they know. Next one. Why have the First Amendment? It's not to protect popular speech. Popular speech doesn't need protecting. The stuff we all agree with doesn't get censored. It's the stuff that's not popular. The idea that we all are entitled to be heard, to have our voice heard. So what is the preferred response to those people who would, the Westboro group, or make the video games, or Phil Robertson? What's the proper response besides government censorship? Yes, sir, young man. Very good. He said you have equal rights to express your own views. Excellent. Let your voice be heard. Can I stop you from thinking something? I can try to stop you from saying it, and that's usually a failure. But I can't stop you from thinking it, that's for sure. But if I let it come out and be said, then I know it exists, and I can confront it with more speech. Next one. Next click. More speech. It allows you to organize, to confront that. Maybe on a college campus, to have that discussion, have that debate. By the way, is hate speech protected by the First Amendment? Yes. So we need to counter it with more speech, to point out why we think it's wrong, to have a dialogue. Not to try to have the simplistic solution of telling people they can't speak. So you could have an economic boycott. I'm not going to watch Duck Dynasty. Well, most of the people that were saying that, I don't think we're watching it in the first place. Now A&E's got a whole lot more audience, but let's have a discussion now. Write about it. Get on the internet. Talk about it, about what he said. And by the way, he also made some comments about marrying young women well before the age of 20, because once they hit 20, they're just picking your pocket, right? And he actually married his wife, I think she was 15, he was 18 or 19. Man knows what he's talking about. Yeah, most of us are inbred anyway, I can tell you that. Somebody had a hand. Yes, sir. And they don't have what? Their countries lack what? The Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. Big difference. And by the way, does it mean that hate speech doesn't exist in those countries? No. They're very intolerant of immigrants and other, minorities. So deal with it out in the open is the solution here. One more. So this is from Texas v. Johnson. I know you're probably not familiar with this case, but this has to do with flag burning. Down in Texas, we were going to prosecute this guy for burning the flag at a political rally. And the Supreme Court, by the way, which does not like flag burning. I'm pretty sure none of the justices have ever gone out and just, that's how they get their barbecue started. They just toss Old Glory on there. If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea offensive or disagreeable, which, by the way, still applies in high schools under Tinker. This gets lost. So questions, more discussion about this whole issue. What you read in that book, and how much of it's become reality, and where are we headed with it? Apparently I have shocked them into silence. All right.
I have a comment.
All right.
I'm a former high school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And And I think we're so missing the boat on the timing of when those classes would be most effectively taught.
But you have to have someone teaching the civics class who's passionate about civics and government and is knowledgeable about it. Hey, look, I'm not against coaches teaching. My best math teacher ever back in Baton Rouge was in junior high school. He was a coach. But he was a real math teacher too. My concern is now where my own son, who went to Edmond North, had this kind of where we had coaches teaching, and I hear it from other students. We've got coaches who don't care. We have teachers, in other words, who don't care about that subject, and that's the real crime here. And so what is that costing us in terms of a future of generations that are involved, civic engagement, that are involved in their society? It's really scary. Other comments, questions? Yes, ma'am. That's true. I understand what you're saying. So that peer pressure, that community censorship will keep people from speaking out on times. I agree with that. But unfortunately, the things I deal with in the law is seeing examples of when a student says something or wears a T-shirt saying something, and the school, the public school, will say, no, you may not, because the principal finds that offensive. Or other students might find it offensive, so no, we're going to stop you. So when those students have had the courage to speak up and speak out, it's not their peer groups that are shutting them down. It's the government shutting them down. And I run into so many students who tell me this happened to them. My students in OSU will say, yeah, this happened, but I had no idea I had recourse, that I could have gone to court, that I could have gone to the Student Press Law Center or the ACLU and tried to find an attorney to fight over this. I had no idea I had that right. Yes, sir. Well, all right, so Tinker still applies, and Tinker says that school administrators can censor high school students and lower, not because it's offensive, but because there's a likelihood, reasonable probability that that speech will cause a substantial disruption to the educational process, right? And so there are cases down in the South where we have racially divided high schools, where there are fights based on race, and courts have upheld bans on wearing the Confederate flag as your dress or as your belt buckle, because it will instigate, there is a likely probability that it will instigate a substantial disruption, a material interference with the educational process. But where I see it, by the way, is those on the right who would say, I don't get to speak up, I'm going to get censored too. There was a young man who had a T-shirt up in Michigan that said, had a picture of Bush and President Bush, and it said international terrorist. And he happened to go to an American Arabic school, and it was large population, and he was speaking out on why he thought the war was wrong. And another part of the country, a young man wears a T-shirt that says whack Iraq, and he gets suspended. He gets in trouble. He has to go to court and fight it. So sometimes it's not just the left, it's the right as well who's getting censored. Which by the way, the judge up in Michigan said, what we're missing out on here is the opportunity to have students learn to tolerate. They don't have to accept, but they have to tolerate that there are going to be diverse opinions in society, and to have civilized conversations about political disagreements, about social issues. We're telling them, no, we're not going to allow it. And then what do they see as role models? Arguing heads from the left and right on CNN and Fox and MSNBC? No civil discourse? we're robbing them, the judge pointed out, of that opportunity, that education. Yes, ma'am. This idea of marketplace of ideas, right? From Milton, John Milton, right? Back Areopagitica, which any student here has had to read it would very unhappy. But there are parts of it that are really good, and one of them is marketplace of ideas. And that is the most used metaphor by the U.S. Supreme Court when discussing First Amendment cases. So that marketplace, how hard is it to get your voice heard in the marketplace? If one side can have more money and have then all the ads, television, newspaper, radio, but what technology is actually helping us, well, it's actually dividing us and helping us self-segregate even more, but also could be an opportunity to speak up, and that's the internet, all the social media. So it doesn't cost anything, as the U.S. Supreme Court has pointed out. You can be a publisher on the internet, run your own website, and that was a couple of decades before Twitter was around. They were talking just about websites. So there's an opportunity there. The U.S. Supreme Court, by the way, actually has treated that marketplace of ideas as mini markets. A university campus, for example, they have said is a marketplace of ideas. And it's easier in that small market to get your voice heard. But you're right, if your market is a national election or a statewide election, it's easy to get drowned out. Well, and that was, of course, what Bradbury's talking about, right? Is the idea that, right? Yeah, and you see what he's pointing out is in the quotes I gave. You know, this starts from the bottom up, and when we all start to accept the censorship of other people, and we don't want to be bothered by those ideas, and we're really looking for just peace and harmony, and we want the superficial and the sensational, and the Winter Olympics will keep us, you know, entertained until the next thing. That's what he's pointing out. It's easier to get to the point where, yeah, it's acceptable to burn books. They're bad. And my point about high school students is, this has been going on for a while, think about the people that are coming out of your high schools. It's going to be easier to tell them that and get them to believe it if they have no concept of what those rights are. Not all of them, but we're certainly missing out on an opportunity to educate more of them. Any other questions? We're a little after 8 o'clock, so going about an hour. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And good luck with the book reading.